Abrania Marrero is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Nutrition at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, with a focus on food systems in small island states, including her native Puerto Rico. Her research portfolio interrogates the interdependence of human and planetary health, the cultural and geopolitical landscapes on which they arise, and agentic pathways towards more just, nutritious, and climate-resilient futures. Welcome, Dr. Marrero.
Thank you so much for having me.
Such a pleasure having you on. I do want to take a step back and really, your work spans several crucial areas, including nutrition, environmental changes, public health, and particularly this focus on small island ecosystems like Puerto Rico. Could you start by sharing what initially inspired you to focus on this intersection of these fields, especially considering the important dependence, in marginalized communities and the loss of food culture during Western transitions and what that looked like?
Absolutely. So, whenever anyone asks me about what kind of inspired my journey into public health and into the academy more broadly, I always like to harken back to my roots and to my family, and specifically to my grandmother. My grandmother, Victoria, she was a woman who was raised in the rural kind of countryside of Puerto Rico in Orocovis. And it's where my family is from. She's my mother's mother, one of 16 living children. And I was raised in many ways through with my grandmother and with my aunts and with my mother. And they taught me to love and to care for others through food. I always like to joke that I have never and never did hear the words "I love you" from my grandmother, but I very much knew that she did. Anytime my plane landed, I was raised here in the States in New Orleans, but anytime we would come back home for the summer months, as soon as we landed, we would get a call asking us, begging us not to stop at a restaurant or at a fast food because she had already been preparing the rice and beans and plantains since, 10 a.m. that day to make sure she had lunch ready for us. And so food as a vehicle of care has always been something deeply embedded in my cultural reality and my lived experience. And food as a vehicle of relationship, not only with others, but also with the land, with the beautiful nature that always kind of surrounded us in Puerto Rico. And my understanding of that relationship increasingly becoming fractured as we increasingly, interact with the world in not so mutually beneficial ways, leading to climate vulnerabilities, leading to the marginalization of knowledge and traditions and practices that once held us firmly close to the land, really inspired me to try to understand ways in which we can reclaim those types of relationships to mitigate our impacts on the climate, on the environment, and to reestablish more holistic and regenerative relationships between each other and with our environment.
The first part of what you said there was smiling because exactly the same thing, and even the South Asian cultures, like food being that language of love and care. So that truly resonates with me. Based on what you said, in fact, you've been deeply involved in studying the impacts of colonial and climatic shocks on local agriculture in Puerto Rico. Could you share some of the key findings from your research and how these shocks have altered traditional food systems?
Yeah, yeah. So, this idea of recognizing structural determinants of health and nutrition, um, you know, relatively new, maybe now a little decades long, right? But kind of going beyond just thinking about, okay, nutrition, yes, depends on our individual behavior, right? It also depends on our food environment, right? Which in many senses has come to mean what food and beverage companies, what supermarkets make available to us, right? And so over the years, we've come to broaden out that understanding even further to think about, okay, well, historically, what has kind of created this environment so full of really unhealthy and highly processed foods? Kind of just aware that our current reality is not at all severed from hundreds and hundreds of years of history. And so looking at a small island like Puerto Rico can really help us look at a little microcosm of much broader patterns that have happened historically since really the beginning of the colonial period. The colonial period, starting around the 1400s, was one in which global North powers found ways to really expand their influence throughout the world in places where indigenous communities had long existed and had long existed creating and cultivating their culturally appropriate foods, right? And so when colonial powers come into these new spaces, one of the first things that they're going to do as they establish the colony is to really shift agricultural production away from traditional indigenous food production practices and towards a plantation economy that is not necessarily producing food anymore, right? It might be producing sugarcane, it might be producing tobacco, but regardless, they are staple crops that are meant to be extracted. They're meant to be produced in bulk in monocultures, and they're meant to be taken back to the country of origin, right? And so that leaves a land in the colony that has flourishing agriculture, but it is agriculture that is not producing food, and it's not producing food for local people, right? And so these decades and hundreds of years of plantation history eventually leads us with an environment that has experienced the negative consequences, environmental consequences of monocultures that we still know today, right? When we think about monocultures, we think of of industrial agriculture, but it's actually a lot, older than that. And eventually, in the Puerto Rican economy, and in many small island economies, many economies made dependent to a bigger economy like the United States within the Caribbean, like Australia, and the Pacific. In the modern era, in the 20th century, industrialization and policies moving towards industrialization are telling these island governments, you know what? You need to move away from agriculture. The new thing is oil industry, is pharmaceutical industry, it's manufacturing. And so in this way, again, we continue this legacy of policies that encourage now a lack of agriculture, period. Um, and therefore a loss of food sovereignty, a loss of these people's ability to kind of generate enough food to be food secure for their own sake, and a need to be dependent on other economies for their local food sources.
And the prevailing reason that I assume for this argument to be made is some sort of associated economic promise or prosperity that can be achieved as a result of sort of this, what may seem as a surface level trade-off to be able to sustain. Speaking of which, then you talked about sort of these alternate foods that then the local sort of economy, then the local folks then get dependent on. Can you discuss what are the types of foods that we're talking about, especially the role of processed foods, largely that is seen now within the Puerto Rican food system? What does that look like, and what is the impact of that you see?
Yes. Something that I think is always surprising, even when I say it, but as well as when we talk about it with colleagues, is, in the early 20th century, as a result of a need for a inexpensive, energy dense staple, right? Largely before this political economic experience of colonization and colonialism, that energy dense staple was largely root vegetables, things that we might recognize as taro in the English language, also yuca, jautilla. In small islands, there's not a lot of land to produce grains. And so what you tend to see a lot of times, both in the Caribbean and the Pacific, are instead of rice and wheat and things of this nature, you tend to see, potato-like foods as that main carbohydrate source. And so it's all that to say, it's always a surprise to learn that rice, being polished rice specifically, right? Not whole brown rice, but white rice being our main carbohydrate, is actually an introduced repercussion of our need to be dependent on an external food source. And so even that we don't tend to see as a highly processed food in our experience of what tradition means. And I always, in the food culture space, it's so important to say that culture is dynamic. Culture is not a static thing that we must always return to, right? There is no stigma that I want to give for people who love rice. My husband is Dominican and he loves rice and beans, right? It has become a part of our history and our traditions, but it's also really interesting to just think about, the history of what we mean by tradition, right? And so increasingly, and I think different from rice as an example, we do have much more recently the introduction of fast foods in every part of the island. In islands in particular, you have what we would call food dumping in the literature. So if you walk into a supermarket today in Puerto Rico and in Hawaii and Fiji, you'll have many, many different aisles of canned meats and canned fruits and if you compare it to a supermarket here in the United States, you'd be surprised at just the amount of canned goods. And at a political economic scale, that's because, again, the larger economy often takes the more expensive, higher quality cuts of meat, right? The fresh fruits that are more profitable and healthier. And they will package in the form of Spam and, sausages and Vienna sausages, the remaining leftovers of the food system, what their populations don't want, and import it to small islands. And so you see lots of processed foods in that particular way, in Spam and things of this nature.
That is so interesting because I've visited Hawaii actually, and often wondered like why does spam why is spam such a big deal, like available everywhere over there, and this helps me contextualize that a little bit and what I witnessed. Community partnerships are a significant aspect of your work as well. How do you approach building these partnerships, and what have you seen as some of the most effective strategies of preserving healthful traditional food customs while combating even food insecurity? Because one can make a case to say, well, canned foods, and I'm just making an argument here, are more shelf stable. It provides nutrients and those types of things that may not sort of live out in fresh foods. Is there an argument there that stands? And then again, how do you combat food insecurity at the same time?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, my calling out of particular foods in no way, I want to make that clear. Everybody is making their own choices around what they want to eat. And with a myriad of different priorities. Like I love spam and the taste of spam, and we'll have it every now and then, right? It's just being real. And as you very beautifully, bring to the fore, um, food processing, like canning, like fermenting, like drying, is an essential aspect of food security, right? Because exactly it brings food and shelf stable products to especially places that the formal market has not yet reached effectively, right? Especially rural areas, especially marginalized communities, you'll find processed foods more easily. And that has an important bearing on food security. I think when we think about community partnerships in my work, it's recognizing that having food security as a priority, having nutrition as a priority, health, sustainability, that doesn't mean that we also can't think about the priorities of local interests and local communities. And often, from a public health perspective, it is human health, it is nutrition, it is food security that we care about. But often, from a community perspective, it is things like food sovereignty that play more to the fore. That it's not just that our plates need to be filled, but that we care about who fills those plates and with what power those plates get filled, right? And so these two things, I think, often get pitted against each other as if one group is working on the better thing versus the other. But it's really recognizing, okay, then how do we all as stakeholders come to the table and creatively come up with solutions that benefit, both things mutually, right? Because at the end of the day, if we're pursuing food sovereignty, but it's difficult to produce a certain quantity or quality of foods right now in Puerto Rico because of such a barren landscape, then we need some kind of safety net to make sure that that people are food secure now while we reinvigorate the local food economy, right? But that's still the goal and that's still the dream. And if we can provide locally in X number of years, X number of decades, and be food secure and be food sovereign, then let's work on that together. And so working with community partners is finding those organizations that I've been so blessed to interact with in these past 6 years who really have those visions in mind and the reality of trade-offs in mind when we collaborate together, and that willingness from both parties to just to learn from each other, to work together, to find the solution that ultimately, regardless of our theoretical differences, makes an impact a daily impact in people and real people's lives.
And which in the second part of the argument there is really about taking it back, being able to create those food sources, those quality dense, sort of nutrition dense foods. Your commitment to promoting climate resilient farming practices is also quite notable in your experience. What are some of the biggest challenges, again, within small island communities that they face in adopting these practices, and what is the pathway to overcome that?
Yes, yes. You know, we can talk about climate vulnerability at an island level, right? We can talk about the lack of local food production being a determinant of periodic food insecurity when a natural disaster like a hurricane occurs, right? So, very simply, a lack of local food sources once import supply chains break down, as they very much do in the immediate aftermath of a hurricane, that will cause 1 to 2 weeks of food insecurity, right? And so we could think about, just generally, there needs to be a local agriculture and an increase in local agriculture and fisheries production. We always, unfortunately, leave the seafood out of it, but especially in island context, that also needs to be elevated, right? So just climate resilience in many ways in these contexts means increasing local agriculture and fisheries, increasing the local food economy, local food processors, local food distributors, local supermarkets, et cetera, et cetera. But on an individual farm level, there are also a myriad of different strategies that both come from traditional indigenous ways of knowing, right? Indigenous ways of producing food have always been more of a polyculture, have always been integrated in forests, like agroforestry, right? And so modern science now has come to recognize that this diversity of food species and also adjacent non-food species that are still, being stewarded in these lands, but not necessarily for their food purposes. Though that diversity, the synergies in that ecosystem that we're stewarding as farmers, as food producers, is actually creating resistance and adaptivity against something like a hurricane, right? Trees help shelter smaller crops from stronger winds, right? Diversity also allows for certain crops to have survived right after a hurricane when others were not able to make it, right? Again, pointing to root vegetables, we talked about, like, from a nutritional perspective or a colonial perspective, but root vegetables are always the ones that survive underground after a hurricane, and it's one of the immediate food sources after a hurricane, and one in which in our studies was very much made explicit that this is what we ate for weeks at a time until we were able to reach supermarkets again. And so it's thinking about diversity on farms, not only in the novel science that has taught us why crop diversification is important, but also recognizing that this is knowledge that has existed for millennia and that we can, again, find synergies in the academic science and traditional ways of knowing.
And I find what you're saying so fascinating because there's a way within which the environment that you live in learns to survive and thrive, right? So when you're talking about the root vegetables, if you think of a hurricane blowing through, these root vegetables survive quite well, and makes remarkable sense because then you turn to even the starchy foods, whatever those root vegetables may be, for your source of carbohydrates to keep you through, right? And it's just incredible how there's a way that the agriculture and the sustainability within an environment, it can really be set up, though it is an island, it can be set up to be in that way. The other part I want to touch on real quickly, because we are coming on time, but as an agent of change in environmental justice and through your various roles, you've emphasized the importance of interdisciplinary approaches in research translation. Can you discuss how these approaches enhance your work and really the impact on public health and environmental justice?
Beautiful. Thank you for that question. Although it might not have been obvious in this particular conversation, I am trained as a population health scientist and a nutritional epidemiologist. And if you talk to me while I'm doing the tangibleness of my research, it's going to be a lot of data analysis. It's going to be a lot of looking at, diet as an exposure and chronic diseases as an outcome, right? And that's just a very traditional way of doing public health, data heavy related nutrition epidemiology work. And I am very much proud of that training and am happy that I have that tactile, in-depth expertise. But as you can imagine, if I'm only thinking about diets as like very kind of individual nutrients or individual foods, and I'm kind of removing all of the culture, all of the politics, all of the climate, all of everything that we've talked about today away out of that context, right? And I'm just looking at what is the, potential effect of magnesium intake on, cancer risk. Those are incredibly important questions, incredibly important. But if we are blind to all of these other realities that also have their own experts in history and anthropology and agronomy and botany, in climate sciences and environmental sciences, if we do not work together across those silos, then we cannot possibly understand the bigger picture. And it's the bigger picture that is where the problems lie and where the solutions lie. And so if I think that it's just magnesium, then my solution is going to be a supplement. It's going to be a pill, right? And so if it's still magnesium, but I'm recognizing that magnesium is in bananas, and bananas is a traditional food in Puerto Rican history, and that we're not eating as many bananas as we used to because of X, Y, and Z, and how does climate impact that, and then my solution to that magnesium problem might be very different, and my partners might be very different because of it.
And I love that multidisciplinary approach that you are taking to this, because it's not only about identifying in the example that you said magnesium has a gap, but it is like, well, let's look at the context of why magnesium is lacking in the first place, and then let's go try to fix that root cause. And sure, and then the pills become the short-term solution, but then there's a longer term, like how do we build that through sustainability in generations to come. This has been such a remarkable episode, Dr. Marrero. I can't thank you enough. At this point, I would love for our listeners to know, how can they connect with you, just stay in touch, and just learn more about your work?
Yeah, so I do have a social media presence. You can find me on X using just my name, Abrania Marrero. Happy to stay connected through LinkedIn. Our research team at Harvard Chan has a website where you can see more of the type of research that we do, the interdisciplinary work that we do. And very soon we'll also have one of our projects, La Cajita Mutua, the Collective Box project, looking at closing gaps in food security by providing locally produced fruits and vegetables to individuals in urban areas of Puerto Rico experiencing food insecurity. That will have a website soon, so I will be happy to share that with you once that comes online.
Oh, that'd be great. And so we'll make sure to follow you on social media so we can get linked up to that. And by the way, for all the listeners, we will link up all of these websites below for you to shortcut over to. With that, Dr. Marrero, thank you so very much for your time. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in into another episode of the Yumlish podcast. Head over to social media and answer this quick question. How do you prioritize nutrition and sustainability while eating food that you love? So hope we gave you some food for thought here. Pun totally intended. Hope we gave you some food for thought here, but think about it. Head over again to our Instagram or Facebook at Yumlish. We'll find you there. Find this podcast post. Comment below again to tell us, how do you prioritize nutrition and sustainability while eating food that you love? We'll continue the conversation there. Dr. Marrero, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.